My name is Jonathan Parker, and I am a member here at Hillcrest Baptist Church. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our church tonight and to our event tonight, Quest for Truth, Know Thy Selfie. If you're new to our church, then let me point out a few things to you. If you walk out of those doors behind you, turn left, and then turn left again down the passage, you'll find the mother's room at the end of that passage, if you or your child have the uncontrollable urge to cry. You'll also find men's and women's toilets down that passage as well. If you find that our seats are excessively comfortable or the refreshments are far too satisfying, then you're also welcome to join us every Sunday for our church services. Our morning service is at 9 a.m. with Sunday school for children during the sermon, and then our evening service is at 5:30 p.m. In a moment, Paul Taylor, our speaker for tonight, will come to us and speak to us about the topic for tonight. Afterwards, we hope we'll have some time for questions, and Paul will have some energy for answers. So please, if you have any questions, hold on to them and ask them at the end. After the Q&A session, we hope that you will be able to join us for supper. The serving stations are along the veranda here, so for traffic purposes, it would be easier if you left through this door and then came back around. Hillcrest Baptist Church started hosting these Quest for Truth events in 2016 as a way of engaging with critical issues that society is wrestling with. We aim to add a Christian voice to the conversations that the world is having. Previously, we have tried to answer questions like, why do bad things happen to good people? How should Christians respond to depression? How should parents deal with sex education taught in schools? And tonight we'll be looking at the issue of identity and challenges for adults and children in navigating the pressures of social media in living out our identities. Social media presents us with opportunities to connect with one another in ways previously thought impossible or perhaps even undesirable. It has allowed us to rekindle long-forgotten friendships and form unlikely new ones. It has allowed us to form communities with people whom we are unlikely to ever meet in person. It has allowed positive and uplifting relationships into our most intimate spaces, but it has also opened the door for negative and toxic relationships. A desire to make a good impression has become a need to curate one's online presence and present a fictional character who bears little resemblance to the real person. The instinct for approval from our peers is rapidly becoming the only lens through which we view ourselves. We measure our value by how many people like our pictures, agree with our opinions, and celebrate our birthdays. Instead of our identity being portrayed on social media is becoming the way we form our identity. Groups with common interests have become groups with common identities. We find ourselves aligning with others without realizing it. In a society experiencing so much change and upheaval, what do we base our identities on? How do we live out these identities with the pressures of identity politics and social media? And how can parents set up the next generation for success in such an environment? Paul Taylor, our speaker tonight, is a gifted speaker and preacher who has worked in full-time ministry as a pastor and today works as a leadership coach and culture consultant. He grew up in Durban North, went to school at Northwood, he has a degree in organizational psychology, and was a pastor at Olive Tree Kloof for 10 years. The son of an Anglican priest, he is married to Bern and has 2 children, David and Beth. Paul, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. We look forward to what you have to say.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you all for having me. It's lovely to be with you. It's a great privilege to have been entrusted with this opportunity. I think I'm starting to realize that maybe the greatest gift we can give anyone is our attention, right? So I don't take that lightly, that you have decided to zero it in on me for the next little while. I don't take that lightly at all. Also, because I'm not a member of this church, I have to confess to you, I'm not even a Baptist. And so it's all the more wonderful that this is such a welcoming and safe space where we can prove once again that it is not necessary to agree with one another to still love one another. It's not necessary to agree with one another to still have productive, respectful, meaningful, useful conversations. I think the world would have us believe more and more that you've got to be exactly aligned in order to have anything to do with one another, and that's simply not true. And so in the spirit of friendship and fraternity and an inquiring mind, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to cue this conversation. I think there are kind of three things swirling around in this conversation. One is the topic of identity, one is the topic of social media, and then the final one is something that Jonathan just sort of slipped in at the end, this idea of identity politics. There's something going on in culture right now. Something I believe quite radical and fundamental has just shifted beneath our feet, and I don't know that many of us have really noticed it or figured out ways to define a pretty massive change that's just taken place. So I want to deal with those three ideas. I don't pretend to be an expert on any of them, and to prove just how much of an inexpert person I am, I'd like your help, please, to define number one, identity. Can anyone just give us a kind of working definition for what we mean when we use the word identity? So shout them out. There are no wrong answers. I wouldn't know if it was. Okay. Thank you, Bram. Very good. I take back there are no wrong answers. Okay. So an identity, if I can maybe riff a little bit of what you've done, at the most sort of simple sense, it's just your name or a number or some kind of designator that defines you as, well, not someone else, right? But when we're talking about living out of your identity or forming your identity or losing your identity, we don't just mean if someone was to nick the book that has that number in it and use it to set up a credit card. We're talking about something deeper, right? So does anyone else want to hazard a sort of working definition of what we mean when we talk about your identity? Who you are, very good, that is right. And how you see yourself, right? So if who you are is maybe something slightly more public, that the world can say who you are, then your identity very much is how you see yourself, who you think you're talking to when you're talking to yourself. That might be quite a good one, actually. Any other advances on what your identity is, or what we mean when we use that term? Great. Your, I suppose, unique lens on the world, so not just how you see yourself, but then from your specific perspective, how you see the world, which even the laws of sort of vision tell us we're all seeing the same things ever so slightly differently. There's no such thing as a perfectly objective point of view. Don't let anyone tell you there is. There is no such thing as a perfectly objective point of view. In fact, even Christians would have to admit that the scriptures tell them they see in part and they know in part. So there is no such thing as an objective point of view, which means your identity has very much to do with the way you see the world. I think I cut one or two off as I was rambling. Great. So there'll be some categories that apply to you that are true. That as much as you are your own very special daffodil, there are also some generic things that are true of you that make up your identity, contribute to your perspective, inform your values. Yeah? What, last one. Anyone else want to throw something into the mix on what an identity is? That's a great example of one of those categories, male, female, other. Anything? All right, I said that was the last one, so that is a good note to end on, just before everyone else suddenly has a good idea based on what I just said. Right, so the next working definition I need from you is one for social media. What is social media? And don't tell me just the names of certain companies that at this moment happen to own platforms, because that's not social media. It is something that those companies engage in. So what is social media? It's a kind of communication. It's media. It's a specific kind of communication. And a way to connect. And a way that is different from other forms. Because it's digital, right. So it's probably for me a whole new place that the same old stuff that was always happening is now happening. And I think it's important that we admit that that's all it is. It is neutral as Old Main Road, with Lineage on one side and HBC on the other. It's just a place that humans do what humans have always done. But it is a place that's very hard to escape from, right? It's a place like no other because it's so insidious. It gets in everywhere. It's hard to leave. It has access in ways that other places and forums don't have access. It's got some features that are unique to it. And so humans doing human things in that place, well, they have the advantage of a whole lot of anonymity a lot of the time. They have the advantage of immediacy. They have the advantage of very slow feedback loops, which means that they can think they're talking to someone who, if they were face-to-face, they'd pick up from your body language or your facial expression, oh, actually, this is a real person who deserves respect. This is not just an idea that I should defeat or ridicule. It's not just some sort of cartoon character I can knock down, but the space that we're talking about, this place, social media, can be a dangerous place, can't it? And so if those are two of the three things, the third one I'm going to do my best to try to offer some definitions about, which is this new thing that's going on in culture right now, which, because of this space, social media, and because of what we've just defined about identities, becomes really important. I want to start by reading you a series of emails that were exchanged between two students at a very prestigious Ohio college, the name of which I will withhold. And at this college, it's Latino Heritage Week. And that involves certain events and one evening lecture on Latino culture. And that talk happens to be on the same night as the intramural soccer league has some games scheduled. And so there is a team whose game might or might not be interrupted by this talk. And so this is the email conversation between two members of that team whose fixture might be threatened by this talk. A white male soccer player emails a Latino female team member the following email. Hey, that talk looks pretty great, but on the off chance you aren't going or would rather play football, spelled F-U-T-B-O-L, which is the Latino term for football. I don't know how to pronounce that in a way that you can see the letters. But anyway, so take it as read that I'm being Leo Messi when I read football. Assume I'm like him in every way you'd like. On the off chance that you aren't going or would rather play football instead, the club team wants to go. Now, we know that that's what he emailed her because very soon she's going to take this private conversation and post it onto a website called Microaggressions, which is a space for calling out subtle forms of intolerance, bias, microaggression, I suppose. And so she posts his email and her response, which I think is interesting. She says, okay, number one, thanks for you thinking that the talk is pretty great. I appreciate your white male validation. I see that it isn't interesting enough for you to actually take your ass to the talk. Sorry, I'm quoting. Number two, who said it was okay for you to say football? See me as Leo Messi as I say that. It's Latino Heritage Month. You're telling people not to come to the talk, but you want to use our language. Trick no. White students appropriating the Spanish language, dropping it in when convenient, never okay. Keep my heritage language out of your mouth. I'm not allowed to speak it. If my dad's not allowed to speak it, then you definitely are not supposed to be speaking it, especially in this context. He replies to her very briefly, basically, I'm so sorry, I don't actually understand what you're saying. So she then replies to that and again posts the whole thread onto this public website. So she says, well, number one, you're not Latino. Call it soccer. You don't play football. Football is played by people, brackets Latino, who know how to engage in community soccer. As someone who grew up on the cancha, in brackets soccer field, I know what playing football is. The way you take up space, steal the ball, don't pass, is far from how my culture plays ball. Secondly, I'm not playing intramural once again this semester because you and your cis dude non-passing the ball, stealing the ball, Spanish-mocking white cohort have ruined it. Number three, I don't care if this email is over the top or mean, so complain to whatever white friends you want about it. You're never going to know what it's like to not be able to play your own heritage sport comfortably because of your gender, race, ethnicity. I'm not sure how you're feeling at the moment, but my anxiety levels rise even as I read this now for the 10th time. So the initial guy replies, so he now does engage in the public thing. And he replies on the public forum, apologizing for the offense, saying it wasn't his intention. He then goes on to explain how his father is actually Costa Rican. He grew up poor, was informally adopted by a Latino family, and is still close with them, and he feels reduced to a stereotype and offended by the way he's been portrayed. He says a few other thoughtful things about his struggle to live a moral life despite his white privilege. Sadly, the original victim lashes back at this as just an attempt to use his Latino connections as tokenism to excuse his racism. You know, some of my best friends are black, that kind of comment that we hear. How does all of that make you feel? And I suppose for the sake of this conversation, what does it make you think, right, if we're on a quest for truth? What is going on here? One explanation, which I like and is good, but I think we might even be able to go a little deeper, is that sociologically, something has shifted in the way we express our strength, or better, the way we try to earn honor and kudos from our community. At one stage, we lived in an honor culture where might was right, where it was important for you to show strength at all times. If you were the victim of something unfair that wasn't your fault, it was still your problem. And you needed to respond immediately with strength. Any show of weakness, any appeal for sympathy, any outsourcing of responsibility to deal with the problem would lower you in the eyes of your community. You would become weaker. No leader could get away with not responding immediately to a slight. If he hoped, or she hoped, I suppose back then more likely than not, he hoped to retain his position, right? So any kind of attack on your honor needed to be responded to with a duel, with I don't know, something like that. And that's not ancient. When modern day rappers hire Bugattis for the day and lots of monopoly money to look rich in their music video, they're doing it to earn esteem in their community. It's an honor-based culture. There is a change that happened, though, from an honor-based culture to a dignity-based culture, where now I'm not going to show you my strength to try to earn kudos in my community. I'm going to redirect my strength into a form of being the bigger person, being higher-minded, showing the ability to have some tolerance or have some sense of perspective. And so this is probably best exemplified in Downton Abbey, right? Lots of very quiet English people seething on the inside and being dignified on the outside. But if you wanted to retain respect in your community and you were slighted, unlike in the honor culture, in the dignity culture, it is best for you to do nothing. It's best for you to respond stoically, to extend some grace, but to nevertheless try to find a way to fix the thing that restores the other person's dignity as well. Whether that's by reaching out, the big old handshake, saying, well, we've dealt with this behind closed doors and we've seen our way to some kind of resolution. Although this does presuppose a level of privilege to be able to live this way, because let's be honest, dignity cultures, there were plenty of people in society who simply weren't even given the luxury of hoping to have any dignity. We do have to see that there's some baked-in classism to trying to live in this way. Nevertheless, it had the same similar idea. Even if it wasn't your fault, it is your problem. The way you respond is important. And the thing you need to do is to downsize the injury you've suffered. That's the most important thing. If you're caught exaggerating the injury you've suffered, if you're caught diving, Leo Messi, and rolling around, I should probably say Neymar, right, if you're interested in football, rolling around, howling, pretending it was really bad, then in an honor-based culture or a dignity-based culture, you have now lost respect. Don't go exaggerating how bad it was. Downplay how bad it was. Show us how strong you really are. And then we'll be impressed. Something radical has shifted, though, to what I would call a victim culture, hasn't it? Where now there is an arms race for sympathy. We have weaponized sympathy. There's only a certain amount going around, and I want to get as much of it as I possibly can. So if that means I need to exaggerate my injury, I'll do that. Instead of appealing to my own personal strength and dignity, instead of saying, well, it wasn't my fault, but it is still my problem, I'm now going to say, even if it was slightly my fault, it's definitely not my problem. And here are all the reasons why you ought to feel sorry for me. Here are all the reasons why you ought to take up my cause. And so a smart thing to do, if that's your plan, is to connect what's happened to you to whatever group your identity refers to. Well, it only happened to me because I'm a mother. It only happened to me because I'm unemployed. It only happened to me because I'm a Baptist, right? It only happened to me because I live in Hillcrest. And if I had lived in Kloof, it wouldn't, but I live in Hillcrest. And if I can, doesn't even necessarily have to be believable, I suppose. If I can ring that bell and say, this bad thing has happened to me, and it's because of the group I'm part of, I stand a really good chance of recruiting the rest of that group to feel sorry for me, don't I? Because I'm saying indirectly, this is an attack on you as well. And so the arms race for sympathy gains this identity element, gains this interesting wrinkle where this is not just something unique to me that happened because, well, who knows why it happened. It happened to me because of who I am. And if you want to be part of the same clan as me, then you better respond with outrage. And if you don't, and this is where the victim culture kind of takes its most worrying turn, I suppose. If you don't, if you want to say, yeah, but it could have been worse. Get up, Neymar. It wasn't such a, you didn't really get kicked that hard, and he hit you in the arm anyway. Why are you holding your ankle? If you want to say, I get that something bad happened to you, but your response is probably disproportionate. There's something wrong in the way you've responded as well. Heavens, don't even try to say something as complicated as that. Because you're either on my team or you're not, right? You're either in my clan or you're not. And something bad has happened to me, and I'm saying it's because of what I am, and therefore, if you don't jump on the bandwagon with me, you're just a hater, just like the others. You clearly hate me. And that's the state that the discourse has got to. So if we go back to this edifying series of emails, you can start to see that very quickly she's gone, look, firstly, I don't appreciate your white male validation. Interesting that she thinks that that's even a valid thing to say. In Philosophy 101, they teach you a thing called argumentum ad hominem, argument against the person, which is to say, you've stopped dealing with the issues, and now you're invoking something about the person who made the argument, and that's a fallacy. That's bad arguing. You're not supposed to do that. It doesn't matter what idiot came up with that point, no matter how dodgy their motives, no matter what agenda you think they might have in making that point, proper thinking requires you to deal with the point on its merits and not fall into the trap of argumentum ad hominem, arguing against the person. But that's exactly what she feels is reasonable to do. I don't appreciate your white male validation. And again, I don't know how you feel about this. I suspect depending on the generation you represent, you might find this more or less hard to understand. But for some, it's like, I cannot believe that this person thinks that's a rational way to think. Others, and I'll show you why in a second, can see there is some logic or legitimacy to why she's doing that. But there's this pivot she makes right at the very beginning, that your slightly tone-deaf attempts to pacify me with using football in my spelling, but actually you'd rather go play the game, and you're encouraging the rest of the team to go play the game, not come to this talk, which clearly she'd really like them to go to. And she feels this is a big moment for her and her Latino friends. She's offended by his email, but it's not just this one unique person who's irritated me. It's because he's white and male. And it's because I'm Latino and female. You know, she'll go on to say later, you have no idea what it's like to not be able to really enjoy your game because of your gender, race, ethnicity. Fascinating that she thinks that gender, race, ethnicity have anything to do with this conversation. She's then, and at this point I got so embarrassed on her behalf, but I don't think she was embarrassed as she said it. She's talking about the difference between soccer and football, the way she and her culture plays it. And she is happy to leak in the fact that actually she just doesn't like the way he doesn't really pass to her that much. And at that point I'm like, oh, so cringy. Like, okay, you're admitting your weakness. You know, because I come from a dignity culture. So I read that going, it's unbelievable to me that you'd be prepared to admit that what you're holding against this guy is not just the fact that he'd like to go play the game instead of coming to the talk on Latino culture, but also that he doesn't pass you the ball enough and that he takes up space in a way that you don't really like and you don't enjoy the way he plays. Right? Because from an honor culture or a dignity culture, you dare not show weakness. you should show strength. You should minimize the injury against yourself. If you don't like something, it is incumbent on you to solve it, not to make it our problem. That's the way of thinking. That's the perspective that many of us have started out with. And so she feels nothing to bring her own weaknesses into the conversation. And finally, I find it fascinating that her final point is, look, I don't care if this email is over the top or mean. Complain to whatever white friends you want about it. You're never going to know what it's like. And there's this idea that there is no such thing as an inappropriate response for a victim. That once you've claimed the victim moral high ground, there is no way that you can respond that we have any right to criticize. Once you are the victim of injustice, right is on your side no matter how you respond. Friends, I think that is a bleak but fairly accurate description of something that's happened in culture. But as I say, I suspect there's an even simpler but maybe even more interesting explanation for this big shift from honor culture, dignity culture, to this victim culture that we are wrestling with today. And it's a struggle that we've had as a species since the Tower of Babel. It's a struggle that we've had, all of us, since childhood, which is our desire to be connected and our desire to be independent. Okay? I really want to be like you. I also kind of want to be better than you, right? It's like my desire for connection and competition crash into one another. And every human being struggles with this. Every small child at some point wants to go, Mommy, Daddy, like we are the same, we are one, and then out of the same mouth, sometimes even in the same split second, but I really want to go and be my own person, right? Leave me alone, like let me be me, stop trying to control me. I'm different from you, but please reassure me that I'm always going to be part of you. This wrestle that we struggle with between individualism and collectivism is something that I think as society we've oscillated between. And even as people, I think we oscillate between it. 1 minute, I want to be part of something. The next minute, I want to be unique and separate. Don't tell me I'm like everyone else, but don't tell me I'm different from everyone else, right? We struggle with this as individuals, and I suspect as a society, we've tended to move from collectivism to individualism quite regularly. Let me define what these things are, and then you can start to try to see if you can spot what's going on right now. In individualism, there's this promise of greater freedom and self-determinism, but there is the risk of disconnection and loneliness, even meaninglessness and depression, right? In hyper-individualistic cultures, it's you. You are, in fact, an island, and you can create the illusion with relationships and with friends on Facebook, but fundamentally, it's you by yourself. You stand and fall based on the meaning you can make out of your own life. And so being dependent on others is often considered shameful or embarrassing. Independence is highly valued. Living an authentic truth is more important than loyalty, right? Because in an individualistic culture, we're very scared of groupthink. Don't tell me I'm doing this because someone else told me to. I'm doing this because I believe it's right in my own unique way, for my own specific, true, authentic reasons. There's a greater emphasis on standing out and being unique. There's a great emphasis on being self-reliant. The rights of individuals tend to take on a higher precedence than what is maybe best for the collective. Conformity is seen as bad. Self-expression is seen as good. This is the individualistic worldview. Collectivism is the opposite of that. And I want to make it clear, I don't think either of these things have a monopoly on being right, because there's pitfalls to both. Collectivism says that there is comfort and strength to be found in situating yourself in a bigger story. It's not about you. It's about the thing you're part of, the group you're part of. It does create the risk for manipulation and groupthink and oppression of individuals, though, right? And so individuals define themselves in relation to others. So if I ask you your identity and you're individualistic, you say, well, I am an extrovert. I am interested in this. I am good at that. And if you're a collectivist and I ask you to define yourself, you'd say, I am part of this family. I am from this town. This is the long line of people that I am part of. That's how I know who I am. Communication tends to be more indirect and oblique and not direct and confrontational, which means social media is just manna from heaven, because I can go, hey, all of you, you know who you are, ... in my status update. Group loyalty is encouraged, right? So loyalty and conformity are seen as intrinsically good. Self-expression is viewed with suspicion. Decisions are based on what's best for the group. Working as a group and supporting others in the group is essential. Greater emphasis is placed on common goals rather than individual pursuits. The rights of the families and communities come before those of the individual. So let's go back up to our Latino friend. She felt it was legitimate to situate her opponent in his groups. You're white, you're male, you play soccer. And to bring in her heritage and context and group into the debate, because she's a collectivist. There is a massive fundamental difference of paradigm, right? And I think it gets really interesting when you've got people coming from an individualistic worldview, where reliance on others is seen as embarrassing, where if it wasn't your fault, it's still your problem, solve it yourself, where figuring out your own authentic self-expression, your own grasp of the truth, that is ultimate, that the rights of the individual are ultimate. And if you're coming from that lens, and then you're interacting with people who are coming from the collectivist lens, no, but the group I'm part of is more important. Loyalty is the ultimate good, not authenticity. Being part of my crew, standing up for us is most important. Then you can see how we just talk straight past one another from the start. And this lot are saying, you guys are selfish and arrogant and disconnected and lonely. And look how many of you are on antidepressants. And this group is going, you guys are intellectually lazy. You're not thinking this through. You're not taking responsibility. You're just hiding behind these titles. And yes, if I'm honest, I am a bit lonely, and I sometimes do wonder about how I'm supposed to make sense of my life. But at least I'm the one making sense of it, and I'm the one choosing to buy the antidepressants. You're just doing what you're told. I think what's going on right now beneath our feet is a big swing from a generation of hyper-individualism to an era of collectivism, which doesn't necessarily have to be wrong, but it brings with it pitfalls, doesn't it? If we haven't noticed. And in fact, it's not yet resolved. And so there's unbelievable levels of hypocrisy going on, that the same person who wants to invoke the groups they're part of the whole time also wants to have the right to complete unique expression, you know. And I don't have to fit into any box. And I don't need to be told what to do, and I don't want to obey. And ironically, both those on the far right and the far left are actually doing the same thing. They're working off the same fundamental premise, this move back to collectivism. So whether it's the Brexiteers on the right, or the Pride marchers on the left, or whatever examples you want to use, the Guardian readers over here and the people that read whatever Trump reads over there, that both groups are essentially still working off the same premise, which is us and them. Loyalty is the ultimate good. Us and them. Loyalty is the ultimate good. There is no moral ambiguity. There are no shades of gray. There's no inappropriate response. If someone in them does something wrong to someone in us, all bets are off. All means are legitimate in pursuit of the ends of protecting us. Any attempt to understand or explain intolerant or offensive behavior in the other group is seen as wavering loyalty, isn't it? Oh, don't start asking questions like that. Are you with us or not? Any attempt to question ancient truths or accepted norms is just seen as apostasy and eroding the kind of core beliefs. And this is not just a political phenomenon, right? This happens in most churches as well, right? There's certain questions you're just not supposed to ask if you want to fit in here. Any attempt to call out immaturity on either side is simply aligning with the opposite. You don't get to say, that white guy was being a little tone deaf, no question. He was trying to win you over with a slapstick use of your language. He hasn't fully understood what you mean by that word and why it is that after all these generations of not being able to speak Latino terminology, it sounds unpleasant in his mouth. He doesn't understand. He does need to learn. But your response, friend, was inappropriate. You went over the line. Now, you can't do that kind of discourse, can you, in a collectivist culture? It's us or it's them. And we don't need to think very hard to start to see the terrifying results of that kind of culture, both in the micro and the macro. You know, if in a marriage, whenever he or she offends you, you just go, well, you're just like your mother. It's because you actually use maiden name. It's because you're actually one of them, you know. And we're different. I mean, that would just be such a daft thing to do. That would be such a career-ending thing to do. Marriage-ending, I suppose I should say. Although every good career really requires... No, never mind. It's a problem at the micro in the other extreme as well. Because if you say, well, loyalty is the ultimate good, then that means that there's nothing that you get to call out. He's treating you terribly. He is sinning against you. But loyalty to my husband is the ultimate good, at the expense of truth. And if it's a problem at the micro, it's certainly a problem at the macro. Political discourse becomes impossible. Facebook already knows which group you're in and what people in your group like to hear, and it'll feed you the facts that you find most tolerant. And we know that this is how those algorithms work. We understand Cambridge Analytics and all the work that's gone on behind social media, where essentially what you are seeing as the perspective on the world that is fed to you is incredibly biased. It's deliberately curated to further your movement into your niche, your silo, your category of people. Again, collectivism has great strengths. It solves a lot of the problems of individualism. But if we've not noticed what's going on, we might find ourselves having argumentum ad hominem kind of conversations the whole time, instead of really talking about the issues and having the opportunity to have proper conversation with people who think differently but who are still worthy of your respect, who you'll probably still learn things from, because all of us see in part, all of us know in part. So it seems we need a resource to navigate ourselves between our longing to be connected and our longing to be individual. And we need a resource particularly that deals with our sense of insecurity, right? Often the reason I want to be part of you is because I'm not really sure I'm okay by myself. But also often the reason I want to be better than you and be competitive with you and set myself aside is also out of some kind of insecurity and pride. I need to prove I'm better. I need to be the tall poppy. Insecurity fuels so much of this, doesn't it? And so we need a resource that can say, you are part of something bigger. Truth still matters. Your own responsibility still matters. That there is a way for you to navigate this world where you don't have to rely totally on number one. You also don't have to lose yourself completely into your group and give away all autonomy or responsibility. We need a way to remain responsible for our own lives and yet completely committed to generosity to others. Because individualism becomes selfish. Collectivism cares about the needs of others, but loses personal responsibility. And this, I suppose, is the part where the church invites you, suckers you in, with the gospel presentation. I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail. As far as I can tell, the only resource that rationally makes sense of those twin needs is the gospel as presented by Jesus Christ. You are worse than you dared fear. You have more reason for insecurity than you ever comprehended. The standard of living for human beings, the way they were designed to live, is so much more beautiful than anything you could ever hope to attain. There is a creator who's going to hold you to account. His standard is so much beyond anything that you could hope to reach. If you were insecure, you don't even know the half of it. But at the same time, he's chosen to fix what went wrong at the Tower of Babel, where we all got scattered into our separate nations and tongues and tribes. Those nations and tongues and tribes are real. Your culture is real. We're not asking for colorblindness. In heaven, the picture is every tribe, every tongue, every nation. There's beautiful stuff in your culture. There's stuff deliberately that God put into your clan, your tribe, your race. Those things aren't supposed to disappear. But he does want to undo the damage that each one of those cultures has ended up inflicting on itself. All of us have got hang-ups, sin, weaknesses, brokenness. And so you are worse than you ever did imagine. Even your tribe is worse than you did imagine. Stop trying to pretend it's the answer. It's not. Every human tribe has problems. But you've been chosen by a loving God who designed you in the first place to be as beautiful as he designed you to be. There's a way back. And that way back starts with individual responsibility and remains individual responsibility. You have to grasp the truth. You have to make the choice. But it also pulls you back into a collective story that's bigger and more important than you. And the thing you're called to most of all is love. And another way of saying that is generosity that costs you something, right? It's valuing the needs of others more than yourself. This tribe that you're called into by the gospel is a tribe whose main reason for existing is to be good news for other tribes, to look out for other tribes, is to be a blessing. There's this interesting move in Scripture where the desire was always to have the world come up and see what God is like in Jerusalem. This centripetal movement, that's the opposite of centrifugal. That there's supposed to be this gravitational pull that all the nations would be blessed by this tribe. It was never supposed to be exclusive. It was never supposed to be us versus them. It was always supposed to be us for them. That's the tribe that God designed. And then at the moment after crucifixion, when Jesus says to his disciples, right now, go, I'm with you, go, it flicks into this centrifugal thing where this tribe is supposed to go out everywhere, completely unexclusive, completely generous. I said I wouldn't bang on about it, but it seems to me if we need to have a sense of belonging and a sense of uniqueness, if we have both this sense of our own dignity and also this insecurity, we need something that can solve both, that isn't just groupthink and it isn't just figure it out for yourself. And I don't know a resource that does that better than the gospel. Whatever your solution to this collectivism, individualism issue, we do know that it's a solution that's needed quickly because social media is bringing this conversation right into your home. So like that poor guy who thought he was emailing someone in private, it suddenly becomes public. So I have one final sort of practical note before we have a few minutes for questions. And I'm just going to steal this lock, stock, and barrel from Christy Herselman, who wrote a book called The Chat, who does a huge amount of amazing education, teaching parents how to have the sex conversation with their kids, teaching kids about how to navigate social media and so on. And her way of describing social media I found really interesting. If, as we said at the beginning, it's just a place, it's just a high street, but it's just a public space, it's neutral, then as a parent or a leader, I should treat it the same way I treat other public spaces. So there are places my child is allowed to go alone at certain ages and certain times of the day, and there are other places they're simply not allowed to go. There are areas in our home where it is appropriate for the whole world to be, and other areas where it's not. So anyone is allowed to look at our front verge and the gate of our house. Almost everyone is allowed to see a little more than that, actually. If they ring the bell and seem legitimate, they could probably be welcomed into the garden or onto the stoop, for a coffee. If you've just moved into the neighborhood, then the axe murderer from down the street, if they bring a casserole, would be allowed onto the front verge. But then there start to be stricter and stricter levels of trust you have to earn in order to be given access to the lounge, for example. Some members of the public are still allowed into the lounge, but only under certain circumstances and certainly only at certain times. And only certain members of the public and that one strange uncle are allowed into the fridge, right? And not everyone just gets to walk in and help themselves. And again, there are very few who'd be allowed into your bedroom and at certain times of the day. There'd be times of the day where no one, except maybe for one specific person, is allowed into a bedroom, okay? So, parents, here's the idea. Firstly, social media is not something, and let's just ensure WhatsApp, TikTok, all the obvious ones, but anywhere where conversation is possible. Group games like Fortnite, that's social media. A public place is social media. Firstly, you don't get to abdicate. Oh, well, my child is in that public space, but I don't really like it. I'm not good with smartphones, so I'm just not going to go. It's just not good enough. You wouldn't do that if they went to the skate park on the beachfront. So you don't get to do that with Fortnite. If that's what your child plays, you need to play. Because it's a public space. And if your child is going to be there, then up to a certain age, it would be insane for you not to be with them. Not to control, just to be there as a source of strength, just to know, so that they can ask you questions if necessary. I know this might sound a bit strange, but I think this makes complete sense. Facebook, for example, which no one under the age of 30 takes seriously, but Facebook is, in many ways, like the front wall of your house. You just post kind of who you are, which means it's inappropriate for you to be posting certain things on the front wall of your house. They're pictures of you and your family that would exist in your lounge and make sense there and would be weird for you to plaster up on your front wall. And so it's just a helpful way to start to think, okay, certain platforms, and if you are a social media user, then apply this to yourself as well. Like, what am I doing on what platform and why? Am I taking things that should be for me and for people I trust, stuff that's true and important and intimate about myself, and plastering it on the front wall of my house, hoping that the passerby goes, like, that wouldn't make sense. Right? Why would I give them that voice in my life? They haven't earned it. And we've been suckered into thinking, but this is just what everyone does, and so I'm going to take the pearls from my life and just cast them before the upper highway. Or in fact, the entire world, right? Whoever, aside from if they're under the wrong kind of government, has access to this platform. And there'll be other platforms which you can then quite deliberately curate who you connect with. Right? So my Instagram or my whatever, that's actually for my people. I'm not going to try and broadcast. It makes sense to do some level of broadcasting. LinkedIn, broadcast away. But there are other social media which are places for you to interact with people you trust. So it would make sense for you to have some filters about who gets there, and that would then impact the kind of stuff you post. But do they get to come into your bedroom and lie in your bed with you? No. So what does your phone get to? And I don't want to prescribe exactly what you do or don't do, but this way of thinking, I think, makes so much sense. And the last comment is, the car that gets your teenager to the skate park on the beachfront is the same as the phone that gets your teenager to TikTok. You own the car, they don't. You buy the petrol and airtime, they don't. Which means this idea of, hey, congratulations, it's your 13th birthday, here's your phone, is insane. It is pure insanity. Walk it back if you've done it tonight. You own that phone, you pay the contract, therefore you are not being controlling, you're not being the Gestapo. If you say, thanks, I'm taking my phone back now, I've lent it to you, you can have it during these hours, you can have it under these circumstances, but there are things that you can do with it that would mean that I revoke your privileges. You're not being controlling, you're being an owner of an asset. And that's about that. So we have a few moments for questions before your hunger gets the better of you. We've spoken about the fact that there is a cultural shift from something very individualistic, which has downsides which we need to own. Individualistic philosophies have even permeated into versions of church, for example. There's some churches that are hyper-individualistic. It's all about the truth you figure out for yourself. There are other churches that are hyper-collectivist, aren't they? There are rites and rituals that you have to do, and the point of these things is more about loyalty and about being part of something than about anything individual. But we have to recognize that socially we're moving from a very individualistic age to a very collectivist age. But we're pretty hypocritical about it at this point. We haven't really figured it out. And the risks of that are amplified by the way social media brings it right into your life, into your bedroom, into the thoughts you've half finished having and have already posted. And so if we want to navigate that space, we need to figure out, well, what is my identity being built on? Who I'm part of, who I am by myself, Or maybe some beautiful thing that cuts the line between the two, which is what God says about you. Thank you. That's what I have for you this evening. Jonathan, do you want to come and chair the question moment, if we've got any time left?
Thanks so much, Paul. If you don't mind receiving my white male validation. So before we move into questions and answers, while you're thinking of those questions, 2 quick announcements that I forgot to make at the beginning. The Media Center is open, and they can pay with card as well as cash. So please have a look around there if you have a moment. And then secondly, for parking, when you are exhausted at the end of the evening, if you wouldn't mind going out this way around the back of the church and exiting out the gate at the back. Any questions? If you do, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. While everyone's thinking of a question, okay, oh, there's Paula.
Hi. Oh, so loud. I know I've got 2 teenage boys in the house, and with the social media at the moment, they're wearing headphones. So they're sitting in the lounge as a collective family, but everybody's kind of doing their own thing, and they are watching YouTube, their own channels, and so they are being very individualistic, but in a collective thing. Mm-hmm. So how do you shut that down?
Sure. I mean, I don't have teenage children, so I am completely unqualified. My only thought on the matter, again, under the proviso that there are others who would be more qualified to talk about dealing with the teenage species, would be that boundaries around how relationships work are always unpopular, will always receive pushback, will always be tested, but nevertheless are critical. So I think the danger often is to vilify things. You know, when the steam engine was first invented, there was a huge amount of scholarly writing about the fact that our human brains couldn't cope with this kind of speed. We were all going to die. We were designed, God gave us the horse, that's the speed we can deal with. And it was like, this cannot be okay. And then suddenly it was. And then cassette tapes were invented. And it was like, the music industry will fall over. There is now, anyone can copy this stuff and do whatever they want, listen to it whenever they feel like it. No DJ has to tell them. It will die, and somehow we survived it. Social media is like that. It's too easy to just sort of vilify, you and your YouTube. And I'm not saying you're doing that, but I think there is a starting point that needs to say, this is a legitimate public space. And just like my dad read the newspaper, you're reading, watching, whatever, interacting with YouTube. So it's not wrong in and of itself. But the conversation, I think, needs to be, well, what kind of relationships do we want to have here in this private space? Because I think we probably do, as a family, have a vision for the kind of relationships we'd like to have. And I know you're a teenager, which means right now you probably won't admit them because it goes against your code. But I'm going to just let you know that this is what we would like for our family, and this is how we'd love to interact with you. And so I'd love for you to tell me what you're watching. I'd love to have conversations with you about what interests you. Let's put the app on the smart TV and watch it all together, you know. And that won't be popular, but that may be one of your boundaries. Like, there's time for YouTube, but YouTube is the whole world. And so the whole world gets access to our lounge only when we're here too. And so there will be conditions under which YouTube is completely fine. And then I think it would make sense if it was my family to say, look, I know you're going to hate this, but there are times which are just headphone-free times. But like, I need you to be able to hear my grunt so that you can figure out that I'm actually feeling a certain way. Because I need you, teenager, in my life. I need your emotional intelligence sometimes. I need you to notice when I'm having a tough time and to be able to pick up on that. And with your earphones in, you don't even notice what I need. So have it in that vulnerable way, I think. This is how we'd like to relate. And I suppose the last thought would be try to include them in the making of those rules. Some rules are going to be made. I'd love for you to help create them. If you won't, I'll do them. but I'd really like your input on how we do this. And what is it that you want to limit on me? Is there time when emails are grabbing my attention, which you prefer me not to? Friends, I think notification management is the key human skill. Now, your ability to manage the way notifications of whatever form interrupt your life. Or maybe you have them muted, but they are still interrupting your life because you can't wait to log on to see what notifications you're going to be told, what mentions you're going to have based on that thing you posted, or the lack of likes that you're going to have. Notification management, figuring out how to put that in the correct box in your life is one of the key skills. And so parents, we're not here to control our children. We're here to teach our children how to control themselves. There's a fundamental difference, which means there is a huge amount of respect and vulnerability needed from parents towards kids. But at the same time, to say, right now, I don't see evidence that you've figured out what the difference between the front gate is, the front door, and the door to your bedroom. And so I'm going to help you figure out those differences and those distinctions. And the more trust I can give you, the better. But show me that you're worthy of it. I think is the right set of ideas. But yeah, again, there may be someone who understands the intricacies of that scenario better than I do. Thank you so much for asking that. That's a really good question. Thank you. At the back there, Fee.
How's it, Paul? Thank you so much for that. I really appreciated that. Do you have any practical advice for an individual's accountability on social media? If one feels convicted that you're using a certain platform too much, or just social media in general. Something I have instituted in my own life is to mute all notifications, so I don't see it. There's the habit of, oh, this person's messaging me now, I need to respond, irrespective of what I'm doing. So that has helped me tremendously. But anything else that has helped you, or maybe you've come across that has been of any sort of help?
So we're asking about accountability of sort of the ways you are using the platform.
That's correct.
It's a very broad question. And the issue of accountability is an interesting one. Because it needs to be invited for it to work, right? So there's often this idea that in whatever setting, churches sometimes, that it can just be imposed when it's not invited, and then that there's no lasting fruit of that, I don't believe. It needs to be invited. What I would say, and maybe this is slightly tangential, but it has some value, I think we tend to speak as though we are certain long before we're prepared to live as though we're certain. And so we're often prepared to pronounce on issues, go to war on comments threads, shoot our mouths off about what's definitely right or definitely wrong. And we speak as if we're certain, while we are in fact still, if we're honest, living as though we're not so certain. And the conviction required to say something is far less than the conviction required to live a certain way. Where I'm going with this is that I think often the way we use social media is as this space, this big public debating hall, where we get hooked into being offended or being outraged, and it starts to spiral us into these places where we're having either fights on social media, or it's just affecting a huge amount of your thought life. That headline, that comment, that troll who managed to hook you with his opinion about something is now living rent-free in other parts of your life, which is just unacceptable if you really sit back and go, no, but I don't want that person in my life. I wasn't intending to think about that at 2 a.m. this morning, and now I am, and so, friends, I think the great wisdom and strength is to say, just as I wouldn't walk down the street with a great big sticker down the side of my car on my opinion about some random fine issue of doctrine or random fine issue of politics. Like, you wouldn't bumper sticker your feelings about Boris Johnson. I don't think you would. So if you wouldn't live that way, why are you prepared to speak that way? If you don't have the conviction to really do something about it and live a certain way, then why do you think you have the conviction to speak about it? I think we speak as though we're certain, even while we're not living like we are. And I would love to challenge myself, and all of us, I suppose, to live like you're certain. And if you really are convinced of this thing, if you have conviction about this truth, then live it out. The next thing you know, you won't even have to say anything about it. Because the strength required, the conviction required to live as though you're certain about something is so much more potent than anything you could say. And so I know that's only a component of the question, but it seems to me if I'm getting sucked into having debates about issues and opinions and fights on social media, it's like, well, show me that you're living that thing out. If you've dedicated your entire life to the future of the rainforests, whatever, then maybe at some point you then have the right to speak about it on social media. But up until then, like, stop bumper stickering around something that's clearly not that important to you. And if other people's opinions that they're firing off are now impacting, now I said at the beginning, your attention is the most valuable thing you have. And so if people on social media, you get to just grab it and do what they want with it, then just be a bit more jealous with it, be a bit more protective of it. Because you and only you are responsible for it. No one else gets to be blamed for what happens to your attention and your thought life.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a whole massive conversation. I'm glad you started. Sorry if I didn't do it justice. Any sort of last two, I think, before we're starving? Yeah.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Ben, as well. I think the one thing that all of us are guilty of at some point, regardless of our age, is the amount of time or the amount of our attention our phones grab from us. I guess what I'm asking is if you've got some comments on how to manage that. I mean, you see it all over the place. I work in a restaurant, and a couple will sit down, and they'll both be on their phones. They're more than likely not communicating with each other, but they're there having dinner with each other. And there seems to be this infection of just social media just drawing us away from human contact.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are your comments on that?
Yeah, it's right. And I'm as much a victim. I know that's the antithesis of the terminology, right? You're not a victim for anything. You're a volunteer to everything, right? But yeah, that happens to me too. It's probably worth saying up front, again, that there's a tone we can take with this conversation that assumes social media is automatically bad. We just need to be careful of doing that. It's neutral. It's just a public space, which means there is a time, I think, when it is reasonable to engage with social media. And I think we need to be deliberate about it, because if we're not, it's going to keep happening to us anyway. So it's probably worth just de-vilifying it slightly. And some of us, I think, are guilty maybe of doing that. Of just going, well, any and all social media is just, you're just caving. Like at some point, it's just weakness. I mean, you'll speak the language of the country you live in. The world you live in right now speaks social media. You can choose not to. You can choose to disengage, and that may, for some people, be a legitimate thing to do for a period. But it's not bad in and of itself. However, obviously, there's a point when you are not in control of it. It is in control of you. I think the awesome, maybe this is just a boy thing, but I think about the way James Bond or some kind of cool, super potent person uses their technology. Okay, work with me here. Like, they dominate their technology. They've got all these fancy wristwatches that do amazing stuff, but he's not sitting there playing with it. It's like, this technology is an asset to me, and I am going to dominate it. I'm going to use the tools available to me to live out the purpose for my life. Seen that way, social media is this incredibly powerful tool for me to live out the purpose of my life. However, I better be living it first before I feel conviction to shout about it and preach about it. Much of the purpose of my life is to connect with other people, so maybe that is the best way to use it. But as soon as this tool, this fancy wristwatch of mine, is now dominating me, I'm not James Bond, right? I'm James Blunt. And so there's threw that in there for the 30 to 50-year-olds. So I think that's the sort of filter often that we need to check ourselves with is who's in charge right now? Are you in charge of this, or is it in charge of you? So Bern, my wife, and I will occasionally just do that. Just go like, do you need that right now, or don't you? And the answer might legitimately sometimes be, yeah, I do. I need to right now I just want to catch up with some mates. I'm just interested in their stories. Like Bern will sometimes say, like, actually, this is just, I'm choosing this. To be honest, it doesn't even matter if it's right or wrong. If you're choosing it, that's okay. But if you're not choosing it, then it seems to me to be a real problem. So that kind of, hey, do you need this right now or don't you? Just checks it. I heard about an app you can install that delays the opening of your social media apps. So deliberate inefficiency, which we could probably do with a lot more of in all sorts of parts of life. But that deliberate inefficiency that just makes you, it just asks you double checks. Do you really want to open this? You can put that on Netflix as well at the end of every episode. Do you really want to watch the next one? Force yourself to choose. You are a choosing being. You are very good at choosing when you give yourself the chance. Most of what society seems to want to do is trick us into giving away that authority we have. But you have the right to choose, always. And sometimes you just need to be reminded. And so that's, I think, maybe a handy thing. As a couple, we try to do that from time to time. Hey, do you need this? Are you choosing that? Do you really want that? Just add that extra beat for you to have to make that decision. And the answer at some stages might be, yeah, I would like to do this. Cool. How long are you going to need? 10 minutes. Great. I'll talk to you again in 10 minutes. Go enjoy the high street and then come home again. Great question.
Cool. Thank you so much, Paul. Really
Pleasure.
appreciate that.
Thanks again. Thank you for having me.
I believe now we are going to have some supper, which, as I said, if you just leave out the back door, turn right, and then come back around, they'll probably be easiest for traffic flow. Perhaps I can just say grace quickly for us, and then I'll let you go enjoy the food. Father in heaven, we thank you for